So closing out the show, are you like me?
No.
You're watching a video on forgotten weapons, and Ian is taking apart some old, rare, and strange gun, and you're wondering, how the heck did he figure out how to do that? Last week, Logan Medish mentions that part of a museum curator's job is to take apart guns in the collection to both document them and preserve them. I bet he might know a bit about this. I would like to welcome back to the Assorted Calibers Podcast, firearms historian Logan Medish. How you doing, Logan?
I'm doing pretty darn good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Now, this is a question that I have had for a little while, and you mentioned in your last appearance that part of the job as a museum curator is to take apart guns that you may get into the collection to make sure that they're not going to be actively rusting and you're going to be losing history while it's on display or in storage, but also to verify the provenance of the gun and see what's original and not. And this is something that I see a lot on forgotten weapons. I mean, again, I mentioned Ian again, but Ian's always picking up these odd guns, and part of his videos is he takes them completely apart and shows you how their inner workings are, which is awesome. I love the inner workings of guns and how people get things to work. But the interesting thing is, as a general rule, when Ian's taking it apart, he's like the only video on YouTube of that gun. And there might be only 5 or 6 of them in existence in various collections. And there's certainly no, manual of arms that you can just, download in PDF format. And so I always got to wondering, all right, here's a gun. You've got a strange and unique firearm, and we've already talked beforehand, so I know you've got some stories, so we could get into the specific stories. But what do you do when a gun that is just a strange thing, and it's before the days when I buy a new gun, like I bought my SIG P365, and I just took it apart because they all come apart exactly the same. And so I already knew how it worked and all that. But now they don't have these conventions on how we take guns apart. What do you do to take the gun apart and do it safely and also safely reassemble it?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to figure out is we have to establish, is it really necessary to take it apart? Because there is always that possibility that, you might break such and such spring, or it might get stretched or whatever, and they're not readily available. And so you have to determine, do we need to take it apart? And if the answer to that is legitimately yes, and not just, well, yeah, I want to, then you take it apart. And I know that when I've done it, we've tried to take pictures of things as they're coming apart and trying to lay them out as specifically as possible. Generally try to do it with someone else there as well, so that you get 2 sets of eyeballs on how things are coming apart, and you never know when you're going to need another set of hands. And you really do just kind of have to wing it. And I imagine, I haven't talked with him about it, but I imagine for Ian, there's probably a lot of stuff that we don't see on camera. He's probably taken apart and reassembled that gun a handful of times before it's filmed to get it right. You just kind of wing it, and you hope for the best.
Yeah, well, I know Ian does mention offhand that he will say, I took this apart earlier, so this is a very stiff part. So he's definitely taken it apart beforehand, and probably with the owner or whoever's the custodian of that gun beforehand as well, just to make sure that there's no pitfalls or springs that are going to fly off into oblivion.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes you have the benefit of having, like maybe a field manual that can help with some things. But even a field manual isn't always the best. And just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean it's going to work that way when you're trying to do it. And the perfect example I have of this is taking apart and reassembling a Pedersen device for the M1903. And this was when I was working at the NRA Museum, and Othnius at c&rsenal and Anvil Gunsmithing, Mark over there, they were trying to get one to run, and they were having some issues with some springs. So they reached out to a number of institutions that had Pedersen devices and asked us, hey, can you take them apart and, measure the length of this certain spring and the diameters and count the coils and all that stuff? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Anything to help get a Pedersen up and running, because they are rarer than hen's teeth. And taking it apart wasn't too bad. I was able to follow the field manual stuff that we had. But when it came time to put it back together, it's not that I didn't know how to put it back together. It's that I physically did not have enough hands to put it back together. And so this is designed to be, in theory, to be field stripped, so you take this thing apart, swap out the springs, and, get it back up and running while you're standing, knee deep in a muddy trench in Europe somewhere. I'm telling you, there's no way in hell that's happening. It's just not expedient to do it. It ended up taking, my 2 hands and a colleague's 2 hands and another 20 minutes trying to hold everything in place and cram it all back together to get it installed properly so that it would function again. And I'm supremely confident if you were desperate enough to have taken your Pedersen apart in the field, of course, if they'd ever been issued, but if you had to take it apart in the field, chances are you were not getting that thing back together, and you didn't have 20 minutes to spend putting it back together. You're going to throw the damn thing aside, grab your 1903 bolt, put it back in, and just going back to using it as a bolt action, because there's just not enough hands to do it.
That's crazy. So do you have any other horror stories? Because that one was pretty juicy.
Yeah, well, this one wasn't so much of a horror story, but it was a very interesting story. It's the Lorenzoni repeating flintlock mechanism, and there aren't a ton of them out there. And there was a researcher who was doing work on the Lorenzoni mechanism and was trying to catalog all of the different variations that were there and get a really good understanding for exactly how they worked and went together. And so, again, at the NRA Museum, we happened to have an example there, and so got to take it apart. And it was fascinating because that's such an unusual mechanism. It wasn't that we were afraid of not knowing how to put it back together, because there aren't a ton of moving parts to it. But the fascinating thing was to see exactly how it does, in fact, go all together and how it works. How is it that when you crank the handle this way, how is it dispensing the powder? And then you crank it that way, and this is where the ball is coming from. And that's how the flash pan is getting opened and things of that nature. And it's stuff that you can tell someone how the Lorenzoni mechanism works, but you don't truly understand how it all goes together and how it actually functions until you can see it. And you can't truly see it until you take it apart. And it's just one of those fascinating things that I'm glad I had the opportunity to take apart, because otherwise it was one of those, I had been told repeatedly how it works, but I didn't really understand how it worked until I got to take it apart and look at all the internals myself.
I gotta say, I hadn't heard of that flintlock before, and so I actually just looked it up while you were talking. And I'll be putting some stuff in the show notes, because that is that is an amazing little Swiss watch of a gun.
Yeah, yes, and that's the perfect way to explain it. A little Swiss watch of a gun, because it's all very intricately done. And like I say, there's not a ton of pieces, but what they're all doing together and working in conjunction to do is really remarkable.
Well, that's awesome. Do you have any others, or do you have any tips for someone who might have themselves something that is not easily field stripped by just basic instructions?
Sure. First and foremost, reach out to me. You can find me, highcaliberhistory@gmail.com. Send me a note. I'll do my best to try to help you out with it. But otherwise, again, I go back to the very beginning, really assess, do I need to take this apart? Sometimes just because you want to and see the inner workings, the juice might not be worth the squeeze, right? And you really got to make sure that it needs to come apart. And so, then I encourage you, take it apart. But be prepared that it might be a lot more difficult getting it back together. You might find yourself in a Pedersen situation, but otherwise, yeah, reach out. There, if I don't know someone, I probably know someone who knows someone, and we can help you get it back together.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning of nowadays, we've got conventions on how stuff takes apart. As a general rule, modern guns come completely apart without tools. They come completely apart in safe manners, and then also as a general rule, they only go back together one way. So there's no confusion. But I believe, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, I believe I haven't done this personally, but I've heard people say that like something like a C96 Mauser broom handle, there is a certain part in there that will go in multiple ways, and one way will result in a functioning gun, and the other way will result in a nightmare of getting it back apart.
Yeah, and I personally haven't taken one apart, but the gun that comes to mind for me that's ridiculous putting apart is the Ruger standard pistol. And up until they came out with the Mark IV with the push button reassembly, the old adage, and I don't know who came up with it, so I can't take credit for it, but it was God came to Bill Ruger in a dream and gave him the design for the Ruger standard, but unfortunately Bill woke up before God could tell him how to put it back together.
I certainly know that I saved up the extra money for a Smith & Wesson 617 revolver because it was worth the extra money for a gun that comes apart just by reloading it.
Yes, exactly. I am not a fan of the Bag-O gun.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, anyone who's been to a gun shop enough has definitely heard about that customer who buys a gun in the morning and comes back in the afternoon with a shoebox full of gun. Can you help me?
Exactly. Yep.
Well, one last thing again, for those who haven't heard, you also do a podcast.
I do. Yeah. Very creatively named. It's just the High Caliber History Podcast. It is aimed at looking at firearms and museums and the research that goes into it, and some of the challenges that we face in a field and environment that is increasingly less accepting of the types of academia in which we work. So if stuff like that interests you, I would encourage you to look us up.
Yeah, and it's super interesting, especially since, again, your guests, you get access to guests that not all the gun podcasts get access to, and so it's really an interesting podcast. So it comes highly recommended by me as well.
I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, if you guys like the ACP podcast, I think you'll like mine as well.
All right, well, thank you so much, Logan Medish of High Caliber History.
Thanks for having me on.